On a Christmas night when the snow buried an entire mountain town in silence, a lone police officer drove a road no one else dared to take. He believed the storm held nothing for him anymore until his headlights found a box half frozen beneath the snow. Inside was a discovery that would reopen every wound he had tried to forget and awaken a miracle he never believed would return. This is not just a story about rescue, it is a story about loss, love, and second chances in the coldest place on earth. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and leave your city in the comments so we can travel this journey together. And if stories of hope, loyalty, and quiet miracles touch your heart, please press subscribe now to support our channel and help us bring you more unforgettable stories. Frostwood Ridge lay folded beneath a blinding quilt of snow on Christmas Eve, a mountain town carved into silence by winter, where pine forests climbed like dark cathedral pillars along the ridgelines, and the single main road twisted through drifts as high as a man's chest. Lanterns glowed dimly through frosted shop windows. Church bells slept beneath ice, and the storm pressed its white palm against every door and memory. Officer Ethan Cole drove alone through that storm, the only moving heartbeat on the road, his patrol vehicle carving two narrow black lines through the fallen world as wind hissed like breath across the windshield. Ethan was 38 years old, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped now, as if winter had learned his name long ago, with dark brown hair trimmed short in regulation lines and a beard that carried flecks of early frost despite his age. His eyes were pale gray, the kind that reflected light without revealing much in return, and his face bore the stillness of a man who had learned to speak less and carry more inside. Years earlier, he had been a K-9 handler, once known for warmth beneath the badge and laughter that echoed through the station halls. But that version of him had been buried with his partner dog after a failed rescue that left frost inside his ribs, where a living fire once burned. Since then, Ethan avoided dogs with quiet discipline, never cruel, never unkind, but always distant, as if teeth and loyalty reminded him too sharply of what he no longer trusted himself to survive losing again. He worked his shifts alone whenever possible, volunteered for the worst hours, drove the loneliest roads because empty space felt safer than full attachment. The storm that night thickened with sudden fury, snowflakes fat as feathers smashing against the glass like 1,000 whispered urgencies, and even the radio remained mercifully silent. Then, at the far edge of his headlights, something broke the symmetry of white, a shape, a line too straight for stone, too fragile for tree. A cardboard box half buried beneath the snow, its top crushed inward, trembling faintly as wind pushed past it. Ethan slowed without thinking, tires crunching, heart beginning to drum with a rhythm he had not heard in years. He told himself it was trash, a fallen crate, nothing worth stopping for in a storm that could swallow a man whole in minutes. But something inside him, the last stubborn filament of the handler he used to be, did not believe that lie. He pulled over, stepped out into the storm, and the cold met him like a physical blow, climbing instantly through his coat and into his bones. Snow reached his knees as he waded toward the box, gloved hands shaking not from fear, but from a memory that woke in him like a buried pulse. When he peeled back the frozen cardboard, the world narrowed into a single breath. Inside lay a German shepherd mother, her powerful body curved protectively around three tiny shapes, her fur soaked stiff, with ice, her eyes dull, her sacrifice complete. She had given everything she had left to give. For a long moment, Ethan did not move. Logic spoke calmly in his head, the same voice he used on scenes no one survived. Too late, nothing to be done. Cold claims what it chooses. Then one of the smallest pups moved, barely. A flicker beneath frost, the white one, its fur pale as snow-lit moonlight, its chest rising with a breath so thin it might disappear if watched too closely. The sound that left Ethan's mouth was not a word, but a broken sound between disbelief and prayer. He tore off his coat, wrapping all three trembling bodies together against his chest, the warmth of his own core suddenly all that stood between life and the waiting dark. The pups were newborns, eyes sealed shut, ears folded soft as petals. The white one pressed weakly against his heartbeat as if recognizing it from another world, while the second, later called Cedar for his faint brown-gold coat and stubborn warmth, kicked feebly, and the third, dark as shadow, and later named Raven, shuddered in silence but lived. Ethan staggered back to the vehicle, his boots slipping as wind clawed at him like a living thing trying to reclaim what he carried. He drove hard for town, hazard lights slicing red through the white, radio crackling with his urgent call to the on-call veterinary clinic. The vet that answered was Sarah Whitmore, a woman in her early 40s with iron-straight posture, softened by kindness, tall and slender, with ash blonde hair usually tied into a practical bun, and eyes that missed nothing but judged gently. She had grown up in Frostwood Ridge, the daughter of a logger lost to avalanche, an event that had shaped her into a person who believed fiercely in second chances and impossible recoveries. Calm and precise by habit, she moved through panic like water through fire, instructing Ethan with steady voice to keep the pups against direct skin warmth, to avoid direct heat shock, to drive without stopping. When he arrived, she was already waiting beneath the clinic's glowing sign, snow clinging to her boots, assistants scrambling behind her like quiet angels. They took the pups from his arms as if lifting sparks from a dying hearth, rushing them inside to incubators and warm fluids while Ethan remained in the doorway, soaked, shaking, and suddenly empty-handed. Through the glass he watched as the tiny chests fluttered under oxygen masks, watched Sarah's calm hands work with swift purpose, watched Cedar's faint movements persist with stubborn rhythm, watched Raven's shallow breathing refuse to surrender, watched the white one falter again and again as if undecided between worlds. Somewhere in the storm, a church bell rang once for midnight, its sound swallowed immediately by snow. Sarah stepped out to him at last, her voice measured but not without weight. They were critical. Hours would decide everything. Hypothermia had bitten deep. The mother could not be saved, but the pups were not yet lost. Ethan nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight not only with fear, but with an ache that stretched backward across years to another night, another storm, another partner whose heartbeat had vanished beneath his hands. He sank into a chair in the waiting room, coat gone, hands raw, eyes fixed on the small windows of light where the boundary between life and death now glowed. Outside, Frostwood Ridge continued its white vigil, unaware that within one narrow room, 3 new destinies trembled on the edge of breath. And on that Christmas night, in a storm that buried roads and erased footsteps, Ethan Cole did not save with strength, training, or command. He saved with the one decision he had spent years trying not to make again. He stayed. The veterinary clinic of Frostwood Ridge did not sleep that Christmas night. It breathed in short, controlled rhythms like a patient on oxygen, every light burning against the storm as though daring the cold to cross the threshold. Inside the narrow emergency room, machines whispered, heat lamps glowed amber, IV lines pulsed with measured drops of warmth, and 3 newborn lives hovered between arrival and departure. The pups were so small they looked unreal beneath the layers of towels and wires, as if drawn from a fragile dream rather than torn from a frozen box on a mountain road. Sarah Whitmore moved between them with quiet authority, her tall, slender frame bending with the ease of long-trained precision, her ash-blonde hair already escaping its bun as the hours stretched deep into night. At 42, Sarah carried the calm of a woman who had seen loss young and learned never to waste the time still given. The avalanche that had taken her father when she was 16 had left behind not fear in her, but a fierce devotion to saving what could still be pulled back from the edge. Her voice remained steady as she adjusted temperatures, recalculated fluids, monitored tiny heartbeats that skipped like frightened birds against the dark. Ethan Cole stood just outside the glass partition, hands braced on the frame, shoulders rigid beneath a borrowed clinic jacket, his eyes fixed on the incubator holding the smallest of the 3. The white pup lay motionless beneath the soft glow, its chest rising so faintly that each breath had to be believed in rather than seen. Sarah had named it Noel for the night it had been lifted from death's grasp, though she had warned Ethan that names too early could wound later. He had nodded without argument, but the name clung to him anyway, wrapping around his fear with dangerous tenderness. The second pup, Cedar, with its faint golden-brown coat even in infancy, struggled stubbornly beneath the warmth, tiny limbs kicking now and then as though already resisting surrender. The third, Raven, dark as poured ink, breathed shallowly but steadily, its body still, eyes sealed, yet somehow alert to the world it could not yet see. Hypothermia had ravaged all three. Their core temperatures had dropped so low that even survival itself seemed unsure of their presence. Sarah explained each measure with professional clarity, though her eyes softened when she believed Ethan was not watching. Warm IV fluids delivered by needles finer than threads, gradual rewarming to avoid shock, oxygen supplementation to coax fragile lungs into remembering their purpose. Each step balanced between salvation and fatal miscalculation. Ethan listened, absorbing every word with the intensity of a man who had once lived by training and procedure, and who had lost everything when order failed him. He did not sit, he did not speak. He stood for hours, unmoving, as if stillness itself might become a kind of offering to whatever unseen force decided these things. Outside, the storm howled its ancient song against the clinic walls, snow climbing higher along the windows, the town reduced to a small island of light, floating in a sea of white oblivion. Midnight passed unnoticed. Somewhere, families unwrapped gifts, candles flickered in warm living rooms, laughter carried faintly through walls. Here, joy waited on breath. When the white pup faltered near dawn, alarms cried softly from the machines, and Sarah's calm sharpened into motion as she adjusted flow rates and heat levels with hands that did not tremble. Ethan's heart stuttered in his chest, as if attempting to mirror the tiny struggle unfolding behind glass. He remembered another room, years ago, another set of monitors flatlining beside the body of his fallen K9 partner, remembered how he had stood exactly like this then too, useless against the finality of numbers falling to zero. The memory pressed against him like ice on exposed skin. He bowed his head for the first time since arriving, fingers closing slowly into fists, not in prayer exactly, but in that raw form of pleading that belongs only to people who no longer know who they believe in. Morning arrived not with sunrise, but with thinning darkness, the storm easing into a quieter descent as pale light filtered weakly through snow clouds. Sarah finally stepped out to him. Fatigue etched faintly into her composed features. The critical window was not closed, she said, but neither had it broken towards safety. The next 48 hours would decide everything. Ethan nodded again, the motion mechanical, and sank at last into a chair in the waiting room, where he slept sitting upright for the first time in nearly a year. He dreamed of snow falling inside empty rooms, of paws leaving tracks that vanished behind him, of a white shape running just out of reach, always alive, always slipping away. When he woke, it was to the sound of small, determined movement. Cedar had begun to squirm more strongly beneath its blankets, a stubborn pulse of will pushing against cold. Raven's breathing had steadied into a rhythm that even the machine seemed to accept as promise. Noel, however, remained frighteningly still, its tiny chest rising only with the mechanical encouragement of oxygen, its body refusing yet to decide. Ethan leaned closer to the glass until his reflection merged with the incubator's glow, his pale gray eyes softening in a way they had not for many winters. "Stay," he whispered once, barely sound, though he did not know who he addressed. The second night fell heavier than the first. Exhaustion crept through the clinic staff, but none left. Sarah's assistants rotated in silent shifts, brewing coffee that went cold before being remembered, changing towels that were scarcely warm before surrendering heat again. Outside, Frostwood Ridge lay buried under its white cathedral roof, the mountain sealed in silence so deep it felt deliberate. Ethan remained where he was, the chair, his anchor, his presence a quiet vigil that no one questioned. At some hour beyond midnight, Noel's heart rate dipped dangerously low. Sarah intervened with swift adjustments, her expression composed, but eyes alert with an edge of restrained urgency. Ethan's hands trembled openly now, the past pressing closer with every beat that threatened to stop. He remembered the sound his old partner's heart had made as it slowed beneath his palms years ago, remembered promising out loud that he would never put another soul in that position again. He had broken that promise simply by stopping, by seeing the box, by choosing to care. Dawn returned in soft gray layers, the storm finally loosening its grip on the town. Cedar nursed weakly from a syringe, responding to warmth with tiny, impatient motions. Raven shifted slightly within its blankets, alive in a small but undeniable way. And then, late in the morning after Christmas, the smallest miracle occurred, without sound or ceremony. Noel opened its eyes. They were not yet the clear, bright eyes of a puppy ready for the world, but clouded slits of awareness, unfocused, fragile as newly thawed ice. Still, they were open. Sarah noticed first, stopping mid-motion as recognition crossed her face. Ethan followed her gaze, and the moment struck him so hard he forgot to breathe. Tears slid down his face without permission, without restraint, without the dignity he had clung to for so long. He turned his head away in reflex, ashamed of the breaking open inside his chest. But Sarah saw, and she did not look away. "It chose," she said quietly, not as a scientist, but as a woman who understood the language of survival beyond numbers. Ethan pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, but the tears kept coming. He was not crying because Noel lived. He was crying because now it could be lost. The old fear had found him again, sharper than before, because hope had sharpened it. And yet, even as that terror wrapped around his ribs, he did not wish the miracle undone. He stayed in his chair for the rest of the day, watching the 3 incubators breathe, watching tiny movements grow a fraction stronger, listening as Sarah explained that the danger was not over, that setbacks could still come, that fragile lives did not unfold in straight lines. He listened and accepted, because acceptance was the only way forward now. Outside, Frostwood Ridge began digging itself out of winter's grip, plows carving roads from frozen silence, townsfolk emerging from their homes with cautious relief. Inside the clinic, 3 heartbeats continued their quiet argument against the cold, and Ethan Cole, once again seated between life and death as he had been years before, did not turn away this time. He stayed with the fear, he stayed with the waiting, he stayed. 4 months after the storm, winter still gripped Frostwood Ridge with white knuckles, but life had begun to move again beneath the snow. Roads were cleared into narrow corridors between walls of ice. Chimneys breathed steady columns of smoke into pale skies, and the mountains stood watch in quiet permanence. Ethan Cole's house sat at the edge of town, where pine trees thickened into forest, a modest wooden structure built decades earlier for logging families who believed in space and solitude. For years, that house had mirrored its owner, orderly, quiet, untouched by unnecessary sound. The silence had once been a refuge. Now, it no longer survived. The 3 German Shepherd pups arrived under a temporary foster agreement authorized by the clinic and local animal services, an arrangement Ethan had signed with a hand that trembled more than he allowed himself to acknowledge. Cedar entered first, already the largest at just under 4 months, his golden brown coat thickening into the beginnings of a powerful adult frame, his paws oversized as if borrowed from the future, his temperament bold and curious with a streak of protective instinct that surfaced whenever Ethan moved too far from his sight. Raven followed more cautiously, her black coat sleek and glossy even in puppyhood, her eyes sharp and observant once opened, her movements calculated and quiet. A thinker by nature who studied before acting. Noel came last, still slightly smaller than her siblings, her white coat soft as fresh snowfall, and her movements gentle, her personality tender and deeply affectionate, seeking physical closeness as though the memory of cold had carved permanence into her need for warmth. They were no longer the fragile sparks Ethan had lifted from death in his hands, yet they still carried the softness of early survival, the kind that lingered beneath growing strength like a hidden signature. Ethan, now visibly caught between instinct and restraint, tried to manage the transition with strict routine. Feeding schedules were set with military precision. Sleeping areas were arranged neatly beside the hearth. Training boundaries were introduced with calm voice and steady posture. For a man whose life had been carved by structure, disorder felt like failure. But disorder arrived anyway, not with malice, but with teeth and joy. The first casualty was a pair of work boots dragged triumphantly into the living room and shredded into unrecognizable offerings. The second was the edge of the kitchen table, scarred with the crescent marks of exploratory biting. Paperwork, maps, patrol notes, records he still maintained out of habit, developed torn corners that told silent stories of secret conquests. And through it all, laughter tried to return to the house in strange, fragmented echoes that startled Ethan whenever he recognized them as his own. At night, Cedar paced restlessly, patrolling windows and doors with the seriousness of a soldier assigned invisible duty. Raven preferred the shadows beneath furniture, emerging only when footsteps changed or voices approached. Noel slept pressed against Ethan's legs whenever allowed, her small body fitting into the curve of his shin as though she had always belonged there. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself attachment was unnecessary. He told himself many things that each small heartbeat quietly contradicted. The breaking point arrived not with noise, but with memory. One afternoon, as sunlight sliced pale through the frost-rimmed windows, Cedar's enthusiastic exploration led him to the narrow shelf where Ethan kept a small wooden box. It was an old habit, storing important items out of plain sight. Inside that box lay the dented police badge of Ethan's former partner, the man who had bled into the snow alongside Ethan's fallen K9 years ago. The badge was bent along one edge where it had struck stone in the chaos of that long-ago rescue, its surface scratched but still gleaming faintly beneath wear. To Ethan, it was not metal. It was a tombstone he could carry. Cedar's tail swept the shelf with joyful force. The box fell. The lid split open upon impact with the floor. The badge slid free and struck hardwood with a dull metallic sound that echoed louder in Ethan's chest than in the room. Cedar, delighted by the skittering object, pounced instinctively. By the time Ethan reached the floor, the badge lay further dented, marked now with tiny tooth impressions along its rim. For a moment, the house froze. Cedar, sensing the shift, stilled and lowered his head. Raven retreated into shadow. Noel whimpered softly and pressed closer to Ethan's knees. The anger that surged through Ethan arrived too fast to shape into words. It was not truly directed at the pup. It was aimed at time, at memory, at the careless erosion of things he had no longer trusted the world to touch. His voice rose sharply for the first time since the pups had entered his life. The dogs responded with immediate, confused submission. And in that moment, Ethan saw himself not as protector, but as threat. The realization struck harder than the damage ever could. Without trusting his own temper, he gathered them with clipped movements and led them out to the covered back porch, a space prepared for emergencies with heat lamps, straw bedding, and windshields. He secured the door and stepped back alone into the quiet interior of the house, his breath uneven, his hands shaking as he stared at the damaged badge lying in his palm. The decision formed quickly, painfully. In the morning, he would contact another rescue facility. Someone better equipped, someone less broken. Outside, night fell with winter's familiar indifference. Snow resumed its endless descent, soft flakes layering over the world as if concealment were mercy. On the porch, the three pups settled into the straw beneath the lamps, warmth pooling around them in the golden halos. Cedar paced at first, restless and uncertain. Raven sat alert, tracking every movement beyond the trees. Noel curled briefly, then rose again when Ethan did not return. Hours passed. Inside the house, Ethan sat in darkness with the badge resting heavy in his hand, the quiet pressing against him like accusation. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He told himself fear was not love. He told himself survival required retreat. But the house felt colder than the porch ever could. Near midnight, unable to escape the stillness any longer, Ethan approached the back door and glanced through the glass. The sight stopped him mid-breath. The pups were not huddled beneath the heat lamps. They were not sleeping. All three sat upright in a rough line before the door, bodies aligned toward the forest beyond the fence. Cedar sat at the center, broad chest forward, ears alert. Raven flanked him to the left, still as carved shadow, eyes fixed on the tree line. Noel pressed close on the right, smaller body upright but steady, her gaze unwavering. They were not waiting for warmth. They were standing watch. The wind pushed snow sideways across the clearing, branches groaning faintly in the distance, and yet the three young dogs held their silent vigil as if summoned by duty they had never been taught. Raven shifted first, approaching the glass with careful steps. She lifted one paw and placed it gently against the door, her breath fogging the pane in small trembling clouds. Noel moved closer beside her, her body leaning forward with quiet expectation rather than complaint. And Cedar, still at center, looked not at the forest now, but directly at Ethan through the glass, eyes steady and unblinking, not accusing, not pleading, simply present. Something broke loose inside Ethan that had been locked in place since the night his partner and dog had vanished beneath the snow years before. The years collapsed into a single fragile instant. He saw again the vigilance of loyalty. He felt again the unbearable weight of responsibility, and for the first time, the fear did not arrive alone. It was accompanied by a warmth he had not allowed himself to name. His hand moved on its own. The latch clicked. Cold air rushed inward, carrying snow and the scent of pine and wilderness. The pups surged forward in surprised unity, not with chaos, but with relief. Ethan dropped to one knee as all three reached him at once, Cedar pressing his broad head into Ethan's chest with innocent strength, Raven circling quickly before leaning in with careful trust, Noel climbing awkwardly onto his lap and burrowing beneath his jacket as if reclaiming a lost home. The sound that left Ethan then was not anger. It was a sob too quiet to frighten them. For the first time in years, he wrapped his arms fully around living warmth without calculating the cost. And in the cold heart of Frostwood Ridge, on a night where snow continued to erase the world beyond the fence, a house that once existed only to keep solitude intact became, without ceremony, a family. Time moved differently after the house learned how to breathe again. A full year passed over Frostwood Ridge in layers of seasons that felt heavier and more meaningful than any before. Spring thawed the last bitterness from the forest floor. Summer taught the pups the scent of warm earth and running water. Autumn laced the mountains with fire-colored leaves. And now winter returned, slower and deeper than the one that had delivered them into Ethan's life. By the time the snow fell again, Cedar, Raven, and Noel were no longer puppies. Cedar stood tall at nearly 80 pounds, his golden brown coat thick and regal, his chest broad, his posture naturally authoritative, as if he had been born carrying invisible rank. His temperament had matured into steady confidence, protective without being reckless, most of the time. Raven had grown into a sleek, quiet force of perception, her black coat absorbing light rather than reflecting it, her movements precise and deliberate, her loyalty expressed not through noise, but through constant awareness. Noel remained the smallest, her white coat now luminous against winter landscapes, her personality gentle and deeply affectionate, still seeking closeness as if cold were a language she had never fully forgotten. To the town, they were Ethan's dogs. To Ethan, they had quietly become his world. He no longer pretended otherwise. His routines had adapted to their presence without conscious acknowledgement. Morning patrols began with 3 sets of eyes following him to the door. Evenings ended with warm bodies pressed around the hearth. The silence that once ruled his life now existed only in memory, and even that memory had softened. It was during one of those winter afternoons, heavy with low clouds and waiting snow, that danger returned not with human intent, but with ancient instinct. Ethan had taken the dogs along the outer boundary of his property to check the fence line where the forest crept closer each year, its wild edges pressing steadily towards civilization. The air was unnaturally still, a silence that pressed downward rather than outward, the kind that animals noticed long before humans did. Raven froze first, her body locking mid-step, ears angling forward with razor focus. Cedar lifted his head, muscles tensing beneath his thick coat. Noel edged closer to Ethan's leg, her body instinctively seeking shelter. Then the underbrush shifted. A mountain bear emerged from the tree line, massive, dark, and young enough to be reckless but large enough to be lethal. It was likely driven lower by hunger, winter thinning its usual hunting grounds. For a fraction of a second, the world balanced on the breath between action and consequence. Cedar did not hesitate. His protective instinct surged forward before training or restraint could intervene. He launched himself between Ethan and the bear, with a ferocity born not of courage but of devotion. The clash was violent and brief. The bear swiped in reflexive defense, its sheer mass overwhelming Cedar's forward charge. The impact lifted the dog off his paws and sent him crashing backward across the snow in a spray of white. Noel cried out, a sharp sound of terror that cut through the cold. Raven lunged forward but halted at Ethan's command, her discipline barely holding against panic. Ethan's training took over, where shock ended. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of sound tearing through the frozen stillness. He triggered the emergency flare from his belt and blew his rescue whistle with all the air his lungs could force through it. Light burst red against the gray sky. Sound shattered the silence. The bear hesitated, startled by the sudden aggression of noise and fire, then turned and vanished back into the trees with surprising speed. The forest swallowed it whole, but the damage had already been done. Ethan dropped to his knees beside Cedar, who lay on his side in the snow, breath shallow and uneven, eyes half-lidded with shock. Blood stained the fur along his ribs where the bear's strike had landed. Ethan's hands moved with trembling efficiency as he checked for deeper wounds, his voice shaking now, despite all attempts at control. Cedar attempted to rise and failed, a low whine escaping his throat more in frustration than pain. Noel pressed her body against Cedar's neck, trembling violently. Raven stood rigid at the perimeter, her eyes locked on the tree line, guarding with absolute focus. Ethan lifted Cedar with careful effort, the weight of the dog solid and real in his arms, alarmingly heavier than any burden he had carried in years. He transported him to the truck with desperate speed, the dog silent now, except for Noel's thin whimper, as Raven jumped into position beside Cedar without command. The drive to the clinic erased itself from Ethan's memory, overwritten entirely by the sound of Cedar's uneven breathing and the pounding of his own heart. Sarah Whitmore was waiting before he even reached the door, alerted by emergency dispatch. Her composure remained intact, but the sight of the full-grown shepherd carried in bleeding through the snow drew a rare tightening at the corners of her eyes. Cedar was rushed into surgery within minutes. X-rays confirmed the damage. A heavy contusion, fractured ribs, internal bruising, but by narrow margin, nothing fatal. He was lucky, Sarah said softly afterward. Ethan did not answer. He sat beside Cedar's recovery crate as if anchored there, his hands still faintly shaking, now that there was no more action to distract from fear. Through the long night, he listened to the dog's labored breathing gradually stabilize, listened to the machines hum their quiet reassurance, listened to the echo of the impact replay inside his own skull again and again. This fear was different from any he had known before. It was not the distant ache of memory. It was immediate, rooted, alive. It was the fear of a father watching a child hover at the edge of harm. When Cedar finally stirred near dawn, eyes focusing weakly, Ethan felt his knees give slightly beneath him. He rested one hand against the crate, not daring yet to touch fur, as if proximity alone might risk further damage. Noel sat pressed against the metal bars, refusing to leave even when staff attempted to usher her away. Raven lay rigid at the door, unmoving, her vigilance unbroken through the entire night. Snow continued to fall outside the clinic windows in slow, steady sheets, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. By morning, Cedar's breathing had eased into a steady rhythm, and the immediate crisis passed. The ribs would heal. Time would restore what violence had broken, but nothing restored the version of Ethan who had believed himself immune to terror. That version did not survive the night. He drove home slowly after the clinic cleared them for rest, Cedar supported carefully in the back seat between Noel and Raven. When they reached the house, Ethan carried Cedar inside with quiet reverence, laying him near the hearth where warmth spread in steady waves across fur and flesh. As the fire crackled and the storm whispered against the windows, Ethan sat beside the injured dog, his back against the floorboards. The long vigil resumed. In the flickering light, he saw not the fearless protector Cedar pretended to be, but the vulnerable soul beneath the strength. And at last, with the truth too heavy to resist, he allowed the realization fully into himself. He had crossed a threshold he could never retreat from. He had not merely rescued 3 animals. He had bound his life to theirs. He bowed his head as exhaustion finally claimed him, his hand resting lightly atop Cedar's chest, where breath rose and fell with fragile reliability. And, in the quiet heart of winter, with snow piling softly against the walls of his home, Ethan Cole understood, with both terror and devotion, that he was no longer a temporary guardian. He was a father. Winter deepened after Cedar's recovery, not with sudden fury, but with a patient, grinding weight that pressed down upon Frostwood Ridge day by day. Snow no longer fell in dramatic storms, but in slow, relentless layers that reshaped the world inch by inch, burying fences, swallowing trails, and softening even the sharpest edges into indistinct white curves. The town moved more slowly now, vehicles creeping along narrow corridors carved between frozen walls, neighbors nodding to one another through scarves and lifted collars, as if every human motion required negotiation with the cold. Ethan Cole returned to duty with the quiet discipline that had always defined him, though he now carried an invisible hesitation in his movements, a pause that had not existed before Cedar's injury. He no longer walked ahead of the dogs without glancing back. He no longer assumed the world would yield simply because he was trained to face it. The dogs sensed the change. Cedar had healed well, though a faint stiffness lingered in his gait on the coldest mornings, a reminder etched into bone that strength did not guarantee immunity. Raven's vigilance sharpened further after the bear encounter, her awareness extending beyond sound into the subtle vibrations of ground and air. Noel, ever attuned to Ethan's inner weather, remained closer than ever, her pale body orbiting his movements like a small, persistent moon. It was on one of those deceptively quiet winter patrols, when the sky hung low and colorless above the hills and the world felt wrapped in dense cotton silence, that the mountain claimed Ethan in its quiet way. He had been called to inspect an abandoned outbuilding on the far ridge after reports of strange lights flickering in the distance, likely nothing more than reflection or wandering hikers. But procedure demanded caution. He left the truck at the edge of the accessible road and proceeded on foot, the dogs fanning out with practiced instinct despite never having undergone formal canine training. The slope beneath the ridge was treacherous with black ice hidden beneath new powder, a trap disguised as innocence. Ethan felt the first slip before he registered the danger, his boots skidding forward as gravity seized his balance with sudden cruelty. He fell hard, his lower back striking frozen ground with numbing force that knocked breath from his lungs. Pain exploded upward along his spine in a bright, blinding surge. The dogs reacted instantly. Cedar lunged toward him, skidding to a halt at his side. Noel pressed her body against his chest, licking at his face with frantic urgency. Raven scanned the tree line in tight, disciplined arcs, guarding against threats real or imagined. Ethan tried to rise and failed. A sharp, sickening ache radiated through his lower spine, locking his muscles into refusal. He attempted to shift again, and the world tilted, darkening at the edges. With immense effort, he managed to call for help over his radio, his voice strained, but coherent enough to transmit location before pain dissolved the last of his strength. The cold moved in quickly once his body became still. Snow sifted onto his jacket, melting briefly on heat before stealing it away. Fever came quietly, as fevers often do, riding the shock of injury like a shadow on water. The dog sensed the danger long before he fully understood it. Raven whined low in her throat, an unfamiliar sound that carried alarm without panic. Cedar braced himself against Ethan's side, sharing warmth through solid contact. Noel climbed onto his chest, curling her small body against his sternum, as she had once done in the clinic when breath itself had been an uncertain promise. Ethan did not remember the moment they reached the house. Later, he would realize that sheer will and the guiding insistence of 3 determined bodies had carried him downhill in painful, fragmented stages, him crawling when he could, sliding when he could not, always flanked by fur and unyielding presence. By the time they crossed the threshold into warmth, night had sealed the world in darkness. Ethan collapsed fully then, his consciousness slipping beneath the surface of pain and cold into a heavy, fevered fog. 2 days passed in distorted fragments of sensation. Heat and chill fought within his body like rival tides. Dreams bled into waking and back again without clear boundary. Somewhere in the haze he heard the crackle of the hearth fire, the faint rattle of the kettle that had once been Sarah's practical gift to him during a winter outreach program, the soft padding of paws moving with quiet purpose across floorboards. But he could not rise. He could not call out. And yet, he was not alone. The pack took its positions not by instruction, but by instinct older than language. Cedar planted himself at the bedroom door, his broad body blocking the entrance like living iron, rising only to drink and return. His presence a silent warning to the world that whatever lay inside was claimed. Raven moved between windows and corners with tireless discipline, watching shadows shift across snow and moonlight flicker against glass, attuned to every subtle change in the outer dark. Noel remained at Ethan's side, her body pressed close along his chest and shoulder, adjusting with unerring sensitivity to the rhythm of his breathing. When his respiration faltered in shallow, irregular pulls, she shifted higher against his sternum, her warmth anchoring him, her steady pulse offering a pattern for his lungs to remember. When the fever climbed too high and his limbs trembled against invisible cold, she nestled closer still, as if proximity alone could negotiate with illness. Ethan drifted through memory and sensation, sometimes seeing snow falling inside the room, sometimes hearing his old partner's voice carried faintly through the fire's whisper, sometimes feeling the familiar pressure of a canine harness beneath his hands, even though no such object remained in the house. But always, beneath everything, there was warmth. Living, persistent warmth that refused to let him slip away unnoticed. At some point during the second night, his breathing caught sharply as panic surged through him, without shape or name. His heart began to race in erratic thunder against his ribs. In that instant, Raven broke her watch and approached the bed with careful steps, her dark eyes focused not on his face, but on the rise and fall of his chest. Noel did not retreat. Instead, she shifted her weight deliberately, placing both front paws along his upper torso, grounding him with gentle pressure. Ethan's breath stuttered once more, then slowly synchronized itself with the firm, unwavering presence above him. Panic receded not through reason, but through touch. Dawn arrived on the third day as a pale silver seam along the edge of the curtains. Light filtered inward like a timid visitor. The fever broke quietly, retreating as stealthily as it had come. Pain remained, deep and insistent, but it no longer drowned the world into haze. Ethan's eyes opened to a ceiling he recognized, yet did not immediately place. For several seconds, he lay unmoving, unsure whether waking belonged to memory or reality. Then he saw them. Cedar at the door, his massive frame rigid but visibly exhausted, eyes bloodshot from sleepless vigilance. Raven beside the window, her body lowered but alert, watching the first movements of the town through frost-laced glass. And Noel on his chest, her white fur rumpled from constant contact, her dark eyes fixed on his face with trembling intensity that vanished into overwhelming relief the instant their gazes met. She let out a soft, broken sound that was neither whine nor bark, but something between question and gratitude. Ethan's throat tightened. He tried to speak her name and failed. Only a breath emerged. His hand trembled upward and came to rest against the curve of her neck, feeling the life there strong and unmistakable. He had guarded lives in snowstorms. He had watched partners fall. He had carried death in his arms more times than he wished to remember. But he had never been kept alive by creatures with no training, no oaths, no promise except devotion. Tears slid once from the corner of his eye and vanished into the fabric beneath his head. When Sarah's knock finally came hours later, drawn by the dog's refusal to let concern fade unaddressed, she found not a patient abandoned by fate, but a man restored by a fire that had never gone out, only been waiting to be guarded. 1 full year passed from the night the mountain nearly claimed Ethan Cole for the second time. Frostwood Ridge moved through 4 seasons, as if turning the pages of a quiet book written in snowmelt, sunlight, falling leaves, and finally, once more, the slow descent of winter. The scars of that year were not erased, but they softened with time, blending into the fabric of ordinary days in ways that no longer screamed for attention. Cedar's ribs healed completely, leaving only the faintest reminder in his gait on the coldest mornings. Raven's vigilance never dulled, but it gentled, becoming something less like watchfulness against threat, and more like devotion to the simple act of being present. Noel matured into her own quiet strength, her white coat now brilliant against winter landscapes, her gentleness no longer fragile but resilient, the kind forged by early survival and sustained by unwavering attachment. And Ethan changed in ways that did not announce themselves loudly. He kept the same job. He wore the same uniform. He walked the same roads. But he no longer moved as a man trying to outrun memory. The house at the forest's edge now carried sound in every corner, soft movement, shifting breath, the steady punctuation of paws on wood. And on the evening of Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the storm that had reshaped his life, Ethan stood alone in the living room beneath the dim glow of the hearth and made a decision he had been circling for 12 months without quite daring to name. From the narrow cabinet above the desk, he took down the old dented police badge. He had never hidden it again after the night Cedar had damaged it. Instead, he had left it resting in quiet visibility, not as a shrine, but as a truth he no longer needed to lock away. He took a simple frame from the shelf beside it and set the badge inside, its imperfections now part of its story, rather than something to deny. Then he placed beside it 3 photographs. The first was taken at the clinic a year ago, 3 impossibly small forms wrapped in towels beneath the incubator's warm glow. The second showed awkward growing bodies months later in his snow-covered yard, legs too long, ears in various stages of rebellion. The third was recent, Cedar standing tall and solid at the center, Raven seated alert and composed at his side, Noel pressed against Ethan's knee with unguarded trust. He mounted the frame on the wall beside the hearth, where firelight caught the metal and the memories alike. For the first time since the night of loss years ago, he felt no urge to look away. Outside, snow fell in thick, patient layers, blanketing Frostwood Ridge in white stillness. Church lights glowed faintly across town, wreaths shimmered in windows, and the distant echo of carols drifted faintly through the frozen air like breath from another world. Ethan fitted leashes onto the 3 dogs with unhurried care. The town cemetery rested on the eastern rise beyond the tree line, a place where wind thinned the snow and stars felt closer to the ground. They had not gone there together before. He had not gone at all since the day the stone was set. The path was narrow and the climb slow, boots crunching softly, breath clouding white against the dark. Cedar walked at Ethan's left, steady and sure. Raven moved slightly behind, scanning with habitual attention. Noel kept close to Ethan's right leg, brushing against him with each careful step, as if measuring the distance by touch. The cemetery lay silent beneath the stars. Headstones crouched like old witnesses beneath snowcaps, their names softened into gentler outlines by winter's steady hand. At the far edge stood the marker Ethan had avoided for years, a simple stone, his former partner's name carved clean and unadorned, and beneath it, the name of the K9 who had died in the same storm. There had never been a body recovered from the ravine where the avalanche swallowed them. The stone had always felt like a lie he was expected to accept in place of closure. Until now. Ethan stopped before it and stood without speaking for a long time. The dogs waited without instruction. Cedar sat with quiet gravity. Raven lowered herself into stillness. Noel remained standing, her body angled toward Ethan as if bracing for something unseen. Snow settled softly on their backs, gathering without urgency. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel chased by the silence. He felt held by it. At last, he knelt. His gloved hand rested against the cold stone. The words came without rehearsal, without the tightening of old rehearsed restraint. "I kept the promise," he whispered into the frozen air. "I stayed. I learned how." The wind moved faintly through the trees, stirring snow from branches in soft cascades that glittered briefly in starlight before vanishing. Ethan swallowed and continued, his voice steady now. And somehow, I was allowed to stay too. The admission carried no bitterness, only release. Noel moved first. She stepped closer and pressed her small body against his thigh. Raven followed, lowering her head near his knee in quiet solidarity. Cedar settled behind him, a silent wall of warmth and presence at his back. The 3 formed a living circle around him, not as guardians this time, but as witnesses. For several minutes the world held its breath around them, and then, without spectacle, Ethan Cole felt something loosen at last inside his chest that he had carried like weight since the day the mountain took his partner and his dog. Grief did not vanish. It rarely does, but it changed shape. It softened from a wound into a memory he could touch without bleeding. When they returned to the house, frost thickened along the windows, and firelight warmed the rooms into quiet welcome. Ethan removed their leashes, and they moved freely through the familiar space, the hearth crackling softly as Noel curled near its edge, Raven settling near the far wall, where she could see both door and window, Cedar lying between them like a steady bridge. Ethan sat on the floor with his back against the couch, watching them with a calm he had not known how to imagine before the storm. Outside, Frostwood Ridge slept beneath fresh snow, the mountain roads erased and redrawn once more into silence. Inside, the house no longer resembled a fortress built to hold sorrow at bay. It had become a place where sorrow was allowed to pass through without ownership. On the wall, the framed badge glimmered faintly beside the 3 photographs. Firelight touched metal and memory alike. The past was no longer buried. It was integrated. And in the quiet hours of Christmas night, as snow continued to fall with tireless patience, Ethan Cole did not feel rescued. He felt released. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come through small, fragile lives that refuse to give up, through a broken man who learns how to love again, and through loyalty that asks for nothing in return. In our daily lives, we all face winters of the soul, moments of fear, loneliness, loss, and exhaustion, when the road feels too cold and too long. But God walks beside us even then, sending help in ways we may not recognize at first, and teaching us that no one is ever truly alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what you felt. Please press subscribe to support our channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And if you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments.